All right, we're going to get rolling here with our two final segments before we have a breakout with the members getting together. Ben Mack from Arctics America has been kind enough to give a segment here on the silica compliance. Back on June 23rd, it was supposed to kick in, and OSHA pushed it back 90 days to September 23rd, and the hope was that it was going to get kicked back again, but it didn't. So the silica compliance on September 23rd did take effect. They, in essence, gave a 30-day grace period from what I understand. So as of October 23rd and going forward, that's when the fines can start piling up on you guys, depending on your market. So it's become a very important topic. The Best Practices Committee spent several calls and hours on this topic. We've posted some resources on SNet on this topic. So if you're interested, just log into your SNet account, and you can go into the search Silica, and there's some examples of a written exposure control plan. There's other documents that we put together, some kind of best practices, things to look for. But we're having Ben today is going to talk about what Arctics has been doing, and Ben will also be at the trade show tomorrow. Arctics is also supporting the member development training, so they've done a good job being a part of this program and other trainings that we've done. And so I'm going to welcome Ben up here to give his presentation. Thanks.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ben Mack. I'm the Director of Marketing at Arctics Americas. And I know that everyone's thrilled to be talking about silica at 3 o'clock on a Friday, so I appreciate the attention. I'm not going to take too much time, 10-15 minutes. And the purpose of my discussion is to not give you a lecture on this new silica rule, because there's ways that we can research that. But what I want to do is give you some highlighted items for you to think about as you leave here today and move forward in your businesses as it relates to the silica rule and changes to kind of keep your eye on the ball in certain aspects of it. I will tell you, I've been with Arctics actually as of today 14 years with the company, and I've been in the cement and concrete business for over 20, and I am not an expert in silica. We know, as many of us, we know a little about a lot of things. And so when this silica change, we saw it coming down the pike from an Arctics perspective. Obviously, being an engineered cement company, we knew it was something that we had to take seriously as a manufacturer as we support businesses in the US, Canada, and Latin America. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about some of the things here from a high level, and hopefully it gives you an understanding of kind of the direction of where things are going. I know that many of you have been working on this for several months. It's not to say that we're experts, but it is something that we, along with StarNet and all the vendor partners for that matter, I think want to continue to work as a collaborative partner moving forward. But specifically, the OSHA directive statement, which is up on the screens now, you, or the employer, shall ensure that no employee is exposed to an airborne concentration of respirable crystalline silica in excess of 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air, averaged over an 8-hour day. It's a lot to say, and trying to say respirable crystalline silica 3 times in a row is not an easy thing to do either. But in general, what does that mean? It just means that the standard requires employers to limit worker exposures to respirable crystalline silica and to take other steps to protect the workers. In general, what they've done is they've made it more stringent on the work site to protect your workers from inhaling respirable crystalline silica, which are the small fines as it relates to silica. So what does that mean exactly? What you'll see if you take a look at the rule, you're going to see something called a PEL, or specifically permissible exposure limits, for a TWA, or time-weighted average. And what it means is up until 2016, so from 1971 to 2016, you can see there were 2 designations as it related to OSHA, both on the construction and the general industry and the construction side of the business. And what they've done as part of this new silica rule is they brought the limits down to 50 on both the construction and the general industry. So they're both the same now. And really what that means is that this a much lower tolerance, or higher tolerance, by which it'll be measured. But a new feature in this rule from OSHA is the addition of what's called the action level, which is at 25. And what that means is ultimately they want their workers, or they want your workers to have zero or minimal exposure to this. But they've created these levels, so 0 to 25, 25 to 50, and above the PEL. In general, what that means, without getting into the heavy specifics, because we would literally be here for 3 hours, it just means that if you're between 0 and 25, there's really not a lot that you have to worry about. If you're between 25 and 50, there are certain protections that you have to take, whether it be respirators or ventilation and things of that nature, and then certain monitoring that has to happen at a certain interval. And then if you're over 50, it even ratchets up further, okay? As Eric had mentioned, the enforcement deadline did kick in on September 23rd, and they gave a 30-day grace period when it came to enforcement of this. But basically what you want to take away from this particular chart is that there are going to be more monitoring of this situation in terms of the levels by which they say, hey, this is going to be acceptable. And over time, I think they just want to make sure that you're doing or taking the necessary steps to protect your workers. Generally speaking, if we move to the next slide, OSHA has identified 18 different practices, typical practices that happen on a work site that may cause an employee or a worker to take in silica or silica dust. And I show this example because the table 1 for the purposes of your businesses is real key to this whole OSHA silica guideline. When you have a chance, and at the end of this presentation, I'll give you some links that'll give you an opportunity to investigate this further if you haven't done already. But when you look at this particular chart, you have the equipment and task on the far left side. So in this particular case, it talks about handheld power saws, any blade of any diameter. That's been an identified work practice that can cause respirable crystalline silica exposure. And what they're saying is they have determined that if you take the following engineering or work practice controls or safety measures, that you will minimize or eliminate the exposure to silica. So in this particular case, it talks about using a saw with an integrated water delivery system, so it basically suppresses the dust. It also talks about using the instruction methods by the tool company on how to use it. And there's also some provisions if you dig into the rule in terms of whether you do it indoors or outdoors, and if it's indoors, there's certain things that you have to consider when it comes to ventilation and so forth. But what's interesting is that it talks about the required respirable protection on the right side. And it talks about a shift that's less than 4 hours and a shift that's more than 4 hours. And it also makes a distinction between whether it's indoors or outdoors. This table 1, which includes 18 different tasks, is really your guidepost. If you as an installer are following the provisions of this table 1, then you don't have to worry about the monitoring of your workers when it comes to respirable crystalline silica. What they're saying is if you can show that you're doing these things on a very regular basis, then you're going to be okay. Okay? We'll talk about what that means if you're not following it in a minute. But I just wanted to give you, I wanted to hammer home the point that if you take nothing away from this discussion other than really understanding this table 1, that's a significant portion of what this silica rule is all about. Okay? So beyond following table 1, there's a number of action items that you have to look at to be in compliance. And as part of the rules, in addition to following that particular table when you're on the job site, these are some key items that you always want to think about and are the most important items as it relates to the new silica rule. The first is probably the most important. Identifying a competent person within your organization who's responsible for compliance, record keeping, for understanding the rule, somebody that can provide information if needed if OSHA happens to show up on a job site. Many of us in our organizations, including Ardex, we don't necessarily have this specific person. You may have somebody who manages risk, you may have somebody who's an operations director, you may have a facilities manager, things of that nature. The key is to really specifically identify somebody who is going to be the lead person to not only manage this for you, but really be your subject matter expert within the company. This is important because if you get asked by OSHA or you get audited, this is the first thing they're going to ask you. Who is it that we can talk to in your organization that's a competent person that has the information, understands the rule, keeps the information on file? The second thing is the exposure levels for each worker. As we just talked about, we have the table 1 that has the 18 items listed by which you can follow. You don't have to worry about the monitoring of the silica. However, there's several applications, and I can tell you from an Ardex perspective, many of the applications that include our products or products similar to ours are not listed in the table 1. So what does that mean? What that means is that it's incumbent upon the installer, the general contractor, or the manufacturer, or a combination of all three, to basically provide information that says, look, in these situations when you are mixing an Ardex thin set, or if you're mixing a patching product, for example, that you have data that shows that you don't have to follow these certain control measures because it's actual data. You've actually done the testing. And you do that through what's called an industrial hygienist. One thing that I recommend is that all of you identify an industrial hygienist locally in your marketplace that you can use for consultation. So obviously if you follow table 1, or if you have actual testing data, and then there's a third option, which is actually listed as number B, or letter B, the objective data. There's other kinds of data that you can use by which that says you have certain compliance within silica and how it's exposed within a certain application. And then the rule actually spells out what those are. So in essence, if something is not on table 1 of those 18 things listed, which is like saw cutting and grinding a floor and things of that nature, you actually have to go out and find the information that says the application will not subject your workers to crystalline silica within the action level of 25 or above. I will tell you that most manufacturers have been working to provide this information, and I think many, if not all of the StarNet partners, you can call directly their technical services department, their R&D departments, and they can provide you the information that you may require for these applications and methods. First place to start is maybe look at their website and kind of go from there. The third thing is hazard communication training. This is something that maybe the competent person can provide, but it's not enough to have somebody that understands the rule. You have to take measures to actually sit down with your project managers and your people to teach them about the rule. Now, OSHA does provide resources by which you can get that information or get assistance on the training. So you have to have an understanding of the rule, you have to have somebody on staff that is going to monitor that and keep records, but then that person will lead the charge when it comes to providing training. And that's something that StarNet is going to provide on an ongoing basis, as they have, for example, this presentation will be made accessible to you, myself and one of our laboratory scientists. We did a webinar about a month ago on this topic. So StarNet will also continue to provide you educational items as it relates to this OSHA rule. Also, you have to have a written exposure control plan. This is detailed in the new Silica rule, and it basically spells out what exactly is your plan of attack. Mapping out when our people are on a job site and when we're doing these types of applications, these are the kinds of safety measures we will put in place as it relates to the Silica rule. So I think that's kind of basically putting it in writing, if you will. And that's a very important component, because if OSHA does an audit, it's not like, oh, well, we're doing this and we're doing that. You can say, great question, let me show you our written control plan. And it's very specific and it's detailed out, and you can match it with the actual rule itself. And then obviously the implementing of the control measures that have been identified, whether it be the engineering controls, certain special work practices, it could be housekeeping. I'll give you an example. As part of the new Silica rule, you cannot dry sweep a floor any longer, which sounds absurd, but it's true. If you dry sweep a floor, and we've all been on thousands of construction sites where you dry sweep a floor, based on this new Silica rule, you cannot do that. So you have to put in provisions, whether it be ventilation or vacuum systems or special methods by which it gives you a situation where you don't have to do dry sweeping. Another example, and something that we use quite often in Ardex from a production standpoint, is compressed air. A lot of times you might be on a job site, somebody will take compressed air and they'll shoot it on themselves, and they'll blow off drywall dust or cement dust, wherever it might be. You are not allowed to do that anymore as a part of this rule. So it's important to look at certain measures that are related to housekeeping that also could affect. It's not just an application, it could be something that you're doing that you think is innocuous, but it truly is against the rule. Obviously, I think there's some parts of this rule that are commonplace, such as the worker access. I mean, if there's a situation where you believe there could be some exposure to high silica dust for whatever reason, you obviously want to minimize that. And then to provide the medical exams, what that comes down to is that there is an application that through evaluation has been determined that a worker will in fact be subject to higher levels of silica exposure, so 25 or 50 and above. There's certain provisions that say you have to provide access to medical exams, and they have to be reviewed on a certain time frame. So for example, it might be within 30 days of the exposure, and then you have to follow up with the information on the results of that medical exam. So the medical exam component is really for those situations where there's a major issue in terms of exposure. But just understand, as far as these action items are concerned, your plan has to have a provision that says, if we have this happen, this is going to be the process we follow from a medical standpoint. So the last slide I have, and I know it's been a brief presentation, it seems like a lot of information, but really, I will tell you that when we started looking at this, as I said on the outset, I'm not an expert in silica, but what you can do is you can take a little bit of time and read through the information. The silica rule itself, I believe, is 26 or 29 pages long, double-spaced, and it does do, I think, an effective job of walking you through the progression of what this rule is all about. And you can find that second link, and again, this presentation will be made available to you. That second link on here actually takes you to the rule itself, and you can kind of walk through it. What I've done is I've saved the rule on my phone, obviously save it on your computer, but these are all part of the learning process and providing to your people. And what we have found is if you take that silica rule and kind of break it down to key components that you can give to your people in layman's terms, that's really the best method. I would not suggest sending the actual silica rule to your people and say, I want you to read this and I want you to understand it. It's best to take a group of people to maybe understand these kinds of things, maybe project managers or somebody within the organization that's been designated as a competent person, and try to break it down to elements that would be understood for your business. I think that's probably the best way to go. That's what we've done at Ardex. I know other manufacturers have done that as well to make it more palatable. The last thing I want to mention is the link there at the bottom, the small entity guide. OSHA has published, and it's probably 50, 60 pages long. It's almost like a booklet on this entire topic. And it actually walks you through why they have the changes, what the changes mean. So it's different than actually looking, when you look at the silica rule itself, it kind of looks like a formatted specification in a way. The small entity guide is more of a manual. It's more of a, written in the narrative. So I think it's all of these links, whether it be OSHA directly or these two particular links, I think that's your first step to understanding it. I will tell you, I've been staring at this now for months, and every time I look at it, I see something that I didn't realize from the last time that I looked. So don't feel like if you're sitting in this room and you feel like you don't have a complete grasp of the new OSHA silica rule, that's okay. I think most people probably feel that way. Another thing I will tell you, and it's something that we looked at from a legal standpoint, if you take the appropriate steps as a business owner or as a manager within your business to make a good faith effort to establish a criteria and a written exposure plan and have people in place that can manage this and teach this, I think if you do get a call from OSHA, I think that will go a long way to minimizing any type of issues that you might have at a job site, because it's very clear between a company who has taken the necessary steps to make a good faith effort versus somebody that has not. And I think that's probably the first place to start. Then the last thing I'll say from a vendor standpoint, I will tell you that sometimes changing labels and SDS information and all that sort of thing is like moving the Titanic or turning a cruise ship. These OSHA regulations that we deal with, whether it be Prop 65 or for California or for OSHA in general, what you'll find, a lot of vendors will be taking the necessary steps to provide you the information that you need, but you may see some inconsistencies from here and there when it comes to packaging or labeling or maybe even an SDS sheet. Understand that It could be just it's a process of making a change over a long period of time. So that's it. I know it's not a particularly exciting topic, but it's a super important topic, and I think it's important for all of us as sort of vendor partners and working in a collaborative way. So I don't know if there's any questions, or if you want to maybe not take questions because of the time, but I will be, from a question standpoint, I will be at the vendor tailgate tomorrow. So if you have any specific questions that I can help you with, I'll be more than happy to at least try to point you in the right direction. That's a great question. So specifically, the question had to do with you mix 2 bags of an Arctic self-leveling underlayment. What's the level of exposure when you're using a rover? What we found is when you use proper vacuum system on the barrel, which is something we show as part of our installation method, that combined with the actual level of silica produced when mixing the bag is well below the action level, so it does not require additional respiration or special what they call safety measures, if you will. And I think it's a matter of, again, following proper installation methods, and I think if you do that, at least from our perspective, you shouldn't have any issues. It is. As a matter of fact, and that's what I mentioned before with all vendors, the good place to start is on the website, specifically with Ardex. If you go to our technical services section, there's a link that talks about the exposure limits and what has been found from actual testing. And then beyond that, if you need specific information, let's say for a general contractor or an owner, we provide specific letters that are addressed to whoever it requires for you to submit as part of a submittal or a proposal on a project. And I think that's pretty consistent with most vendors in the industry. But yeah, so it should be available in the public domain, I would think, for most vendors that have done that type of testing. Yes, sir. Well, I would tell you, generally speaking, the products that contain the most amount of silica would be a product that's heavily sanded or has a bigger aggregate or more aggregate. Would be something like a deep fill patch or a material that is used to do like maybe a trench repair or something along those lines. Those types of products typically have a bigger aggregate and more aggregate so that they do what they're supposed to do. A product like a self-leveling underlayment, although it has silica, it also has it's polymer modified, and there's different components, so it's not fully sanded, if you will. And then typically patching products either have no added sand or it's very low. So I would tell you that from a substrate preparation standpoint, most of the products that you deal with, really there shouldn't be an issue as long as the manufacturer has done the appropriate testing. One thing I will tell you though is that we found it's been sort of a long process for us. It's taken a lot of time, but it's, I think, in the end going to be worth it, is all of the testing has to be similar to or mirror what the actual applications are in the field. So when we do the testing with an industrial hygienist, we actually have our technicians in a real-life application setting, mix up 3 or 4 pallets of material, which is then monitored by an industrial hygienist over several hours. So you can imagine the amount of time that takes, but in the end, the results should help you as business partners to say, hey, look, when I use this type of product or system, I shouldn't have any issues, and here's the paperwork which proves it.
How about inlet pile or stone or gravel?
Same thing. I think for like a standard thin set or a grout, I think the levels of sand are as such that it shouldn't be an issue. I don't want to speak for all manufacturers, but I think generally speaking, I don't think you'd have too much of an issue as long as the appropriate testing and evaluation had been done. And that's really the tough part about this whole situation, is that when you're talking about silica testing and silica evaluation, I mean, you can imagine if you take all of the vendor partners that deal with StarNet from a substrate preparation, concrete repair standpoint, and you add up all of the SKUs that we sell, you're literally talking in the thousands. So what happens is that you sort of go down this path of, well, if I do this, what happens? And what if I do that, what happens? And that's when I get back to the whole good faith component, is that you can't cover every base, but if you start down that path, I think it's clear that you can work around that, because it's at some point it goes on forever.
Cool.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.